Villisca Axe Murders, 1912, Iowa, Part 2. Night of the Axe. Section 1. When the clocks wound back. Police reports do not state the exact hour of the night, because no one knew. The clocks in the Moore house had stopped. Each one showed a different time. Some were a little past midnight, others were earlier. This was a detail that crippled the investigation from the start. That night, it was as if time itself had shattered inside the house. But when the pieces were put together, a picture emerged. It is believed the murders took place between midnight and 5 a.m. on the night of June 9th. This was a wide window, but one thing was certain. The house had remained alone with the attacker for a long time. This was not a hit-and-run job. This was a stay. Let's start with the attacker's entry into the house. There was no forced entry at the doors, no broken windows. This strengthens two possibilities. Either the door was unlocked, which was very common in Villisca, or the attacker was someone known to the family. But the second possibility opens a darker door. Because if they were known, they must have been in this house before. They knew the layout. They knew who slept in which room, which stairs creaked, where the axe was kept in the kitchen. These were not things to be guessed at random. When the attacker entered, the house was not yet completely silent. It was in the first stage of sleep, the time when people are most vulnerable, yet can wake up to the slightest sound. So the attacker waited. This moment of waiting is the most chilling part of the story. He likely stood downstairs, perhaps in the kitchen, perhaps in a dark corner. He listened to the footsteps. He counted the breaths. He waited for sleep to deepen. This was not the act of an impatient person. And then, the movement began. The police agreed that the attack began in the downstairs bedroom. This made sense. The greatest threat in the house was there, the adults. Josiah Moore was a strong man. If he woke up, he could fight back. Therefore, he was the first target. But there is a crucial detail here. There were no signs of a struggle in the room during the attack. This suggests that Josiah almost never woke up, or he never had the chance to. The attacker had approached the side of the bed. He brought the axe down from above, but mostly it wasn't the sharp edge that was used. It was the back. This choice was deliberate. The sharp edge bleeds. It makes noise. It creates a reflex. The back silences. This detail shows that the attacker prioritized silence above all else. After the work downstairs was finished, the attacker did not stop. He did not leave the house. At this point, what most people would expect is panic, haste, and flight. But the night in Villisca was not like that. The attacker went upstairs. The stairs. These stairs were later tested many times. Policemen went up and down. Every step made a sound, but some spots were quieter. The edges, the parts near the wall. The attacker knew this. He entered the first children's room upstairs. Here, the order of the attack was determined by the position of the beds. This shows the attacker did not just walk in and swing wildly. He approached. He took his position. Again, silence. And again, there was no rush. None of the children had tried to escape. The beds were not disturbed. This suggests they were either in a deep sleep or were incapacitated in a very short time. At this point, it must be said, this was not a burst of rage. This was an act of control. After the children upstairs, the attacker turned to the last room in the house, the room of the visiting girls. This room was the most vulnerable place in the house. Two young girls, in a strange house, were in a deep sleep after a tiring day. Leaving this room for last was no coincidence. The attacker was clearing the house step by step. And after the job was done, this is where the Villisca night turns from a murder into a nightmare narrative. The attacker did not flee. He returned to the kitchen. There were signs that he had eaten. It was clear a chair had been pulled out. Crumbs were found on the table. This showed that someone had sat in the house after the murders. This thought shattered the minds of the townspeople. Because this was not the behavior of someone fleeing in fear. It was the behavior of someone who was comfortable. The mirrors were covered. The curtains were tightened. No one knows for sure why these things were done, but these behaviors offer a window into the attacker's mind. Perhaps superstition, perhaps guilt, or perhaps not wanting to face himself. And then, the attacker left the house. When? Unknown. How? Unknown. But we know this. He left behind more questions than could ever be solved. And after that night in Villisca, no one ever saw the night the same way again. Section 2. Order and silence. For the police, the hardest question was, what was the order? In the Villisca night, the order of everything mattered. Who was targeted first? Who last? Which room did he move to next? Because the order would reveal the mind of the attacker. Initial data pointed to the downstairs bedroom. There were several reasons for this. First was the presence of adults. Second, it was logical for the control of the house to start there. Third, there were no signs of panic upstairs. If something had happened upstairs first, the adults downstairs would likely have woken up. But they didn't. This strengthened the theory that the first step was the lower floor. There was another detail in the police reports, the direction and location of the wounds. These details were not shared with the public, but they were decisive for the investigation team. It was understood that the attacks were made from the head of the bed. This showed that the attacker did not wander around the beds, but worked from a specific point. This suggested the attacker knew exactly where the targets were. Moving upstairs after the downstairs bedroom was a risky decision. The stairs creaked. Every step could be an alarm. Yet the risk was taken, because it was part of the plan. The first children's room upstairs. It is thought the attacks here happened very quickly. Because the beds were hardly disturbed, the sheets were not mussed. This showed there was no resistance, but this also makes one think how close the attacker got. At this point, a debate began among the police. Some thought the attacker knew the children, because moving through the room without hesitation, heading to the right bed, finding the target even in the dark, these were not coincidences. Others argued it was simply experience. Someone who had been in similar houses before. Perhaps someone who had done the same thing elsewhere. But there was no evidence for this second theory. As the sequence progressed, the attacker's rhythm emerged. Every room was similar to the last. Same method, same silence, same control. When he reached the visiting girl's room, a different detail stood out. This room was at one of the furthest points of the house. To reach it, one had to pass through a narrow hallway. In other words, the attacker had traversed the entire house. He hadn't turned back. He knew the location of the room. This almost entirely eliminated the random possibility. What was done after the attacks ended was even more terrifying than the sequence itself. Police believed at least several hours were spent in the house after the attack. The reason for this was the traces found in the kitchen, the chair being pulled out, the crumbs on the table, the fact that some items had been moved. These were not things done in a hurry. At this point, the investigation hit a breaking point. Because the attacker was no longer just a killer, That night, he had used the Moore house. The thought sent shivers down the spines of even the investigators. Another important detail, the lights. No gas lamps had been lit in the house. This showed the attacker moved comfortably in the dark. Was moonlight enough? Or did he already know the inside of the house? Some police officers said the attacker's eyes were accustomed to the dark. This gave rise to the possibility that it could be someone who worked at night during that period. A night watchman, a train worker, a traveler. But again, nothing was certain. As the hours passed and the duration the attacker stayed in the house lengthened, every movement became more meaningful. The covering of the mirrors drew particular attention, because this was done after the attack, not in a rush, deliberate. The meaning of this behavior has been debated for years. Some thought it stemmed from a religious or superstitious belief. There were common beliefs back then, especially in rural America, that the souls of the dead could get trapped in mirrors. Mirrors were covered to prevent spirits from remaining in the world. Others argued it was a psychological behavior, not wanting to see oneself, not facing what one has done, not being reminded of one's humanity. This second interpretation was more chilling, because it showed that the attacker was aware of what he had done, but did not want to accept it. The curtains were treated similarly. The curtains in the house were closed much more tightly than normal. This prevented the morning light from entering. It was as if the house was consciously kept in the night, as if the attacker did not want to face the day. Or he didn't want anyone to notice that someone was inside. Another detail in the police reports was the preservation of silence. No furniture was broken. There was no unnecessary destruction. This showed the attacker was still being careful. There was no panic, no chaos. At this point, investigators focused on the profile of the attacker. The picture that emerged was this: male, physically strong but not hasty, accustomed to the night, prioritizing silence, valuing spatial control, not challenging authority, but not afraid of it either. This profile brought several possibilities to the agenda. Transient workers, lone men wandering along train lines, those working night jobs, or someone from within the town. The last possibility shook Villisca to its core, because it meant everyone suspected one another. As the investigation progressed, more speculation arose about what the attacker did in the house. Some police thought the attacker rested in the house. He might have sat in the chair, perhaps putting his head in his hands. Perhaps he regulated his breathing. This moment was perhaps the only moment the attacker was alone with himself. But he didn't run. This gives rise to the possibility the attacker was waiting for the morning. This idea was never officially accepted, but it spread rapidly among the townspeople. If the attacker had stayed in the house until morning, if someone had arrived just a little earlier, these thoughts made nights in Villisca sleepless. Another striking detail was the way he exited the house. The doors were closed silently. They weren't locked, but the door wasn't left open either. This showed the attacker's need for order. Everything had to be in its place. When combined with the mirrors and curtains, this obsession with order gave the sense that there was a clear structure in the attacker's mind. This was not a disorganized mind. This was a mind that planned, executed, and then controlled. And perhaps the most terrifying possibility was this: this might not have been the first time. Investigators looked into similar incidents. Were there crimes committed with similar methods in other towns? With an axe, at night, with silence. But records were insufficient at that time. Many incidents were either not reported or their details were lost. So, could Villisca be just the first known incident? That question remained unanswered in the file. But it remained in the memory of the town. Because what happened in that house in Villisca was not just for one night. That night showed how dark and how patient a mind could be. And that patience was perhaps the most frightening thing of all. Section 3. The Man Who Stayed. There is one single fact that sets the Villisca axe murders apart from other similar events. The killer did not flee after finishing his work. This sentence was underlined repeatedly in the investigation files, because this detail moved the entire case into a different category. This was not an attack born of panic. It wasn't a loss of control. It was certainly not a momentary outburst of rage. This was the work of someone who wanted to stay. According to police reports, the exact amount of time spent in the house after the murders could not be determined. However, traces in the kitchen, moved objects, the position of a chair, and remains on the table suggested that this duration was measured in hours, not minutes. This thought was unbearable for everyone in Villisca, because it meant that for a portion of the night, the attacker sat alone in the Moore house, under the same roof as 8 lifeless bodies, in total silence, feeling no pressure to escape. But why? The answer to this question lay within the attacker's mind. First, it must be said, if an attacker remains at the scene after a murder, it is usually for one of 2 reasons. Either they are afraid of the outside world, or they are comfortable being inside. In the Villisca case, the second possibility carried more weight. The attacker's behavior showed he was no stranger to the space. His ability to move in the dark, navigate to the correct rooms, and use the kitchen. These were not the actions of someone entering a house for the first time. But more importantly, the attacker displayed ritual-like behaviors in the house. The covering of the mirrors was at the forefront of these behaviors. Every mirror found in the house had been covered after the attack. This process had not been done in a haste. The cloths were placed neatly. This showed that the attacker was still in total control. This detail split the investigators into 2 groups. One group believed it stemmed from superstition. At that time, especially in rural America, there were widespread beliefs that the souls of the dead could become trapped in mirrors. Mirrors were covered to prevent spirits from lingering in the world. The other group argued it was a psychological behavior. Not wanting to see oneself, refusing to face what he had done, avoiding a reminder of his own humanity. This second interpretation was more bone-chilling. It suggested the attacker was aware of his actions but refused to acknowledge them. The curtains were treated in a similar fashion. The curtains in the house had been drawn much more tightly than usual. This blocked the morning light from entering. It was as if the house was being held in the night by choice, as if the attacker did not want to face the daylight. Or he didn't want anyone to realize someone was still inside. Another detail in the police reports was the preservation of silence within the house. No furniture was broken. There was no unnecessary destruction. This showed the attacker remained cautious. There was no panic, no chaos. At this point, investigators focused on the profile of the attacker. The emerging picture was as follows. Male. Physically strong, but not hasty. Accustomed to the night. Prioritizing silence. Valuing spatial control. Neither challenging authority nor fearing it. This profile brought several possibilities to light. Transient workers, lone men wandering along the train lines, those working night shifts, or someone from within the town. This last possibility shook Villisca to its core, because it meant everyone suspected one another. As the investigation progressed, more speculation arose about what the attacker did while in the house. Some officers imagined the attacker resting, sitting in a chair, perhaps putting his head in his hands, perhaps regulating his breathing. This moment was perhaps the only time the attacker was alone with himself. But he did not run. This gives rise to a chilling possibility. The attacker was waiting for the morning. This idea was never officially accepted, but it spread rapidly among the townspeople. If the attacker had stayed in the house until morning, if someone had arrived just a little bit earlier, these thoughts made nights in Villisca sleepless. Another striking detail was the manner of exit. The doors were closed silently. They weren't locked, but they weren't left open either. This showed the attacker's need for order. Everything had to be in its place. When combined with the mirrors and curtains, this obsession with order gave the impression of a very clear structure in the attacker's mind. This was not a disorganized mind. This was a mind that planned, executed, and then audited. And perhaps the most terrifying possibility was this. This might not have been the first time. Investigators researched similar incidents. Were there crimes committed with similar methods in other towns? With an axe, at night, in silence. But records were insufficient at the time. Many events were either not reported or the details were lost. So, could Villisca be only the first known incident? That question remained unanswered in the file. But it remained in the memory of the town. Because what happened in that house in Villisca was not just about a single night. That night showed how dark and how patient a mind could be. And that patience was perhaps the most frightening thing of all. Section 4. What remained behind the night. No one knew when the night ended. When the attacker left the house, Villisca was still asleep. The streets were dark. There were no lights in most of the houses. Morning hadn't started yet, but the night could no longer be considered ongoing. This moment of transition is the most vulnerable time of the night. Neither fully dark nor light. The hours when everything is blurred. The attacker seemed to have chosen this time. The door closed silently. It wasn't locked, but it wasn't left open. This detail did not escape the attention of those examining the crime scene, because it was not a sign of a hurried exit. It showed that control was maintained until the very last moment. The house was alone once again. But it was no longer as it was. Hours later, when the town began to wake up, the silence in the Moore house still continued. This was the silence that started everything. The kind of silence that was out of the ordinary, that made people pause, that triggered instincts. The first person to approach the house paused before opening the door. He would later say he felt something was wrong, but at that moment he couldn't describe what it was. He just thought he shouldn't go inside. Still, the door opened. And from that moment on, the Moore house was no longer just a house. Those who were inside struggled to put what they saw into words. No screams were heard. No panic ensued. It was more like a freezing, as if the human mind shuts itself down when faced with such a reality. The police were called, but by the time they arrived, the house was already full. Neighbors, relatives, the curious, everyone wanted to see something. This was one of the biggest mistakes made. Because the evidence was contaminated. Doors were opened, curtains were parted, the coverings on the mirrors were removed. People went in and out of rooms, they stood on the stairs, they looked up, they went down. Every step made the truth a little blurrier. By the time the police reached the scene, it was too late. The order inside the house had been disrupted, but still some things were clear. The manner of the attacks, the silence, the fact that there was no rush. And most importantly, the lingering atmosphere inside the house. This was something that didn't make it into reports, but was felt by everyone. It was as if the house didn't want to let go of what had happened. As if something remained suspended between the walls. The investigation lasted for days, weeks, months. Suspects were interrogated, some many times. Statements were taken. A confession was expected, but nothing became clear. Every clue led to another question. Every answer created a new void. This uncertainty slowly consumed Villisca. People began waking up at night. They flinched at the slightest sound. They started locking their doors. This was a big change for the town, because in Villisca, doors were not locked. But now they were. The Moore house remained empty. No one wanted to live there, but the house continued to stand in the middle of the town. It became a place everyone passed by but tried not to look at. Yet people did look. And while looking, they said they felt things. Coldness, heaviness, sounds coming from upstairs at night. These were not evidence, but they were part of the town's memory. In the end, the investigation was not solved. The file did not close, but it did not progress either. The killer was not found. Dozens of theories were produced as to why he wasn't found, but no theory took the place of the truth. Because the truth was there. In the silence. And this house in Villisca was no longer just a crime scene. It was a reminder. Some nights pass, some stay, and this night never left Villisca.